Mark Carney's father's time as a principal of a federal Indian day school in the Northwest Territories has made some headlines this week, including a story currently on our website, aptnnews.ca, and a column by one of our panelists, Niigaan Sinclair. For more, Niigaan is joining us, and so is Sheila North, back to help us out again this week on the Truth in Politics panel. Sheila, Niigaan, thanks for being with us. Niigaan, we'll start with you as we, of course, wanted to talk about your column this past week about Mark Carney's father, who is believed to have run a federal Indian day school and who also defended his problematic legacy with Canada's systemic mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. Can you tell us a bit about what you found out while working on that column?
Yeah, so a lot of misinformation is out there. So yeah. I'm glad that we get a chance to sort of correct the record, not talk about, simply taking Robert Carney's legacy, Mark Carney's father, and then placing it on Canada's new Prime Minister, because he said things that are quite different to his father. But simply put, Robert Carney, for a brief period, was a principal of a day school. He was the principal of a day school in Northwest Territories. It was a school that included both a high school and an elementary school. And then for a period of time very short amount of time, ran schools as a superintendent kind of model, overseeing the schools in the Northwest Territories. So naturally would have seen, and therefore the residential school system as we would now know it, of course, a system that highly problematic and of course very violent for many of those who experienced those schools directly. And then later, as a historian at the University of Alberta, he did things like run for office, lost in Edmonton, and then later defended his legacy as a participant within the residential school system. Wrote many essays talking about the more or less complaining about the ways in which others, like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, personified residential schools. He said things like, why aren't we talking about the good stories? Why do we have to keep focusing on trauma? Really things that we now know of as highly problematic. And we would often call those kinds of individuals residential school denialists, not that they are denying the schools or that even that atrocities happen at the schools, but then wanted to sort of obscure the legacy of the schools by talking about a few good experiences, or maybe somebody learned a skill or had a good day here and there. The fact is that residential schools, nothing about that policy was beneficial. It never should have happened. And so Robert Carney, I think, is on the wrong side of history. And one thing I also discovered is that Mark Carney is not his father. So he has said a lot of things that are certainly contrarian to his father. He says things like Canada's economy should be run by Indigenous knowledge and values, which anyone who believes in residential schools would never say. So clearly Mark Carney, I think, has to be accountable for things that his father said. But at the same time, I think he's broken away from that legacy and is on the way to do so more.
Sheila, your thoughts on this and whether it should have an impact on Mark Carney's run here?
No, I think I appreciate Niigaan's perspectives and laying it out there. I do understand why people would be concerned and make those associations. And for that, I think that Mark Carney at some point needs to come out and straighten that out on what he thinks and how differently he might think, because it is an issue that we all have come to see more of how people think about what happened during these times. Sure, there might have been good outcomes here and there, but the assimilation and the atrocities that happened during those times outweigh all of those, and we can't deny that. And I think that at some point he does have to come out and clarify his thoughts on it, even more so.
Niigaan, more to come on that on our website later today. Niigaan, we had NDP leader Jagmeet Singh join us in studio yesterday, and I'll just mention that we did try to get Mark Carney in studio while he was here as well, but they said they didn't have time. We asked Mr. Singh about a couple of ridings held by Indigenous MPs or important to Indigenous peoples in those ridings that might be up for grabs. Do you think that the NDP is at risk of losing seats like Nikki Ashton's, Leah Gazan's, Laurie Idlut's?
The NDP is fighting for its life, period. If Winnipeg Centre, which is Leah Gazan's riding, is under threat, and I don't polls are not suggesting that that riding is under threat, but certainly that there is, for the most part, a paper candidate being run by the Liberals, someone who has almost no experience, is a youth from the youth Liberal wing of the party. They did not put up somebody who they expected to do well in that riding. But if that position, that person is polling okay, meaning not way off in the distance, but actually close to Niigaan, a staunch NDP riding, you know that everywhere else the NDP is in trouble. Nikki Ashton's certainly in trouble in the north. Very strong candidate, and Rebecca Chartrand, who has infrastructure from the last time that she ran in the north. Undoubtedly, that will be a race to watch. And then also, there is kind of a split vote that looks like in the riding of Elmwood-Transcona. We've got while the NDP did pull that out in a by-election about 6 months ago, they're looking like, because of the changing of boundaries, because of the resurgence of the Liberals in that area, that the NDP are in trouble. So basically, what we have is Manitoba's the lifeboat of the NDP. If there is no support, or if there's a lack of support, or people decide that they're going to turn to the Liberals instead of the NDP, you're going to see the NDP perhaps lose party status in this election, which is a whole uphill battle, a hole that's going to be very difficult to get out of.
Yeah, Sheila, some polling does have the NDP losing official party status. Do you think that that's possible?
It's entirely possible at this point, I think, although, it has a lot more to do with all of the country, all of Canada. I think we're seeing a different race this time from 2015, when Justin Trudeau was getting into power and his government, and we were just all coming from a conservative government, and many Indigenous people were getting involved because of the concerns that they had with the attack on Indigenous, sovereignty and treaty rights and all of that. And so it's a different kind of feel right now. I'm not sure if the Indigenous people are as engaged at this point. It doesn't seem like it. None of the parties have made it a priority of any of our issues at this point, except, it might not seem like it, but inadvertently they are, because they keep talking about natural resources, and they keep talking about Canada as a sovereign nation. And many people that are staunch and protectors of treaties will say that Canada is not a nation, so therefore it can't be a sovereign nation, sovereign country maybe, but difference in nation and country. So yeah, I think that is a different election, is going to be interesting how it plays out. And I think we need to see more participation from the Indigenous leadership to pivot. Like, everyone is pivoting to make themselves relevant to the topics of the day. And I think Indigenous people and leadership also need to do that, and start sending messages that are relevant to the topics, and that includes the effect of Trump in the United States to this election.
Niigaan, going back to the Carney campaign, when he was in Winnipeg this past week and asked why there was no Indigenous policy announcement and what that signaled about his party's stance on reconciliation, there was a lot of fumbling there about meeting with the Innu and the Métis and First Nations, then Inuit, all well in Nunavut. It's one of the only questions he's taken on Indigenous issues this whole campaign. Should people read anything into that?
There's two things happening there. First is, Mark Carney's not a politician. So he's literally learning on the job. And what that means is and he was very shielded during the leadership campaign for the Liberals. What that meant was he didn't really do media. We at the Winnipeg Free Press, we interviewed him, but he didn't agree to go out live on our podcast, which kind of tells you where he was at. He is learning as he's going, so he is not prepared for questions that are off script. And I think to come to Winnipeg and not expect a question about reconciliation is what we would call a rookie mistake. It's right up there with getting the École Polytechnique information wrong. It's right up there with getting, we've seen a number of fumbles that Mark Carney has done out of the gate as Liberal leader, because he's simply just not a politician. He's learning as he goes. Thankfully, he has Donald Trump to take away the news every time, so that the media focuses completely off of any mistakes that he makes. Which brings me to the most important issue. He has to start, when we finished the taped version just a minute ago, Sheila was talking about Inadvertently, every federal leader is talking about the economy. That's chapter 2. Chapter 1 is Indigenous rights. You have to work with communities, nations. You have to be fluent in understanding Bill C-15, the thing that the Liberals passed through, understanding that Canadian law must come into concert with Indigenous rights. Then you got to know the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Here's a fact, and the fact is that Mark Carney spent most of his life away from Canada. So he perhaps, unlike many of us who are aware or cognizant or become conscious of Indigenous rights just by simply operating in society, simply by going to a university, taking a mandatory credit, or just reading a newspaper or watching a TV program, you become familiar that Indigenous rights are a part of a conversation involving landed resources. And this is not a complaint about Mark Carney. In fact, I think what it tells me is that he spent a lot of time away. He's bringing expertise that this country desperately needs, especially when it comes to battling tariffs and Trump. But he needs people around him now that have expertise. He desperately needs people who are strong on Indigenous rights to be able to make the chapter 1 conversation before the chapter 2, or he's going to upset a lot of people. And I think you saw a little kind of annoyance of that in Winnipeg with not understanding some really basic tenets around Indigenous peoples and rights.
Sheila, do you believe that a Carney government would be committed to Indigenous issues?
Well, I would hope so. I think that the party has history and recent memory of the efforts that it made towards reconciliation. I hope that continues further than just up to this point. I hope and I trust that our people are going to keep holding that party and all the parties to account on that, because we haven't finished the work on reconciliation. We need to keep going. And by chance, I ran into Carney just before that big rally here in Winnipeg. And I thought about what question can I possibly ask in a short amount of time on what's something that he can think about. And I said to him, like, treaties are interrelated to tariffs. And by that, I meant that you can't impose tariffs and forget about our rights and our rights to the land and waters and resources that you're talking about. So I was trying to quickly make those connections, and he said, yes, I agree, and we're going to be working on that when we're done this part, he said. So I trust that he knows all of that. And I do remember meeting with him when it was then Grand Chief Derek Niigaan, when he was the Bank of Governor of Canada at the time in 2012, 2013. So he was aware, and he is aware of the Indigenous factor. And I think that there's things to build on there. But as Niigaan says, we need to have the right people around him to start to shape that and to start to look forward into the future on what that could look like for the benefit of the whole country, not just a few of us.
100%, yeah.
Niigaan, as we are set to settle into week 2 here of the campaign, what do you think is the biggest issue that we're not talking about?
Well, yeah, of course, the problem is that Trump just sucks all of the air out of the room. Every time Trump goes to a microphone, everybody sort of waits with bated breath, and then the news cycle changes. It really doesn't matter. And what you really feel for is all the other federal leaders. Like Mark Carney gets to act like a prime minister. He gets to respond. People will listen. It's hard to run a campaign right now. And I think that I feel tremendous sympathy or empathy for Jagmeet Singh. I mean, he made some pretty significant comments when he was in town, talking about the factors around Indigenous rights, but particularly arguing that there is a reason that we have elements of pharmacare or that we have childcare is because of the coalition between the Liberals and the NDP. And in many ways, Jagmeet Singh is probably one of the most successful NDP leaders. But yet you have NDP stalwarts, Tom Mulcair being most notable, kind of saying that you might want to vote for the Liberals this time around because of Trump. So it's a hard election. It's hard. The thing that I think is probably the most interesting is that the auto sector, as we know, is now under duress due to the tariffs of Trump. We know that the auto sector only operates because of elements and relationships with Indigenous people, especially when it comes to EVs. Or when it comes to energy. And so the auto sector and energy are both dependent deeply on treaty and Indigenous rights. And I wish that there was more conversation. Like I long back to the time in which at leaders' debates, one of the four main questions would be about Indigenous peoples' rights. And Mark Carney's in charge of the Liberal Party, which put most of their political chips in the middle when it came to Indigenous rights, reconciliation, fulfilling the 94 calls to action. And to see that not abandoned as much as, but just not talked about, it makes me think that arguably Indigenous rights might be the most important issue lacking, and with a close second being the environment, but I actually think the two are very intertwined anyway. So,
Sheila, your thoughts on the biggest issue that we haven't been hearing about?
Well, I think that we are hearing Indigenous issues when we talk about what Niigaan just said about the interrelatedness between the natural resources and the environment and our rights to them. I think that we are there, but in a different form. But what we're not seeing is Indigenous representation at some of these tables and thoughts. We hear the Conservative leader, Poilievre, talking about when he makes his 5 points, his bottom point is our Indigenous people and their rights. And so now he's claiming us because he knows that's where the help is going to come when push comes to shove, when at the end of the day, what's going to keep this country together is our rights to the lands and our resources. And I think all of the parties realize that and know that. But how do we maximize that messaging? I think it's a huge responsibility on us as Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people to make those connections. If media is not paying attention, we need to speak louder to say our rights are here and they're not going anywhere. And this is why we want, and this is what we want, and this is why we want participation at the table. So a lot of work to do left.
Well, still 3 weeks to go. A lot can happen, I guess. Niigaan, Sheila, we'll leave it there. Sheila, thanks again for helping us out this week.
Oh, you're welcome, like I say.
You got Sheila, thanks.